Hello, thank you so much for joining us for today's Mobile Cause Interactive Workshop on Strategic Storytelling for Nonprofits. If you're looking to create great content that can better connect with and engage your audience and do it more efficiently and from a more heartfelt standpoint, then you are in the right place. During today's workshop, we will discuss some compelling and vital insights into what makes for exceptional storytelling that really cuts through the noise. Then we will work side by side through the 5 key components of authentic storytelling so you can get a leg up on crafting your next great story. If you haven't already, you'll want to take a moment and download our worksheet for today so you can follow along with our writing exercises. The handout section is located on the right-hand side of your screen. You should see that Word document there for download. This is an interactive workshop, so we want you to participate in our discussion today. Please ask us your burning storytelling questions by submitting them into the questions box on your control panel. We will answer them during and at the end when we have a Q&A session with our experts. We hope you enjoy today's workshop, and as a reminder, we will be sending out the recording and slides to all registrants afterwards. Today's webinar is presented by Mobile Cause. As a fundraising professional, you have a million responsibilities and a few resources. Mobile Cause is here to help. Mobile Cause delivers comprehensive end-to-end fundraising software that's easy for you and your donors to use. You also receive campaign creation and setup from a fundraising expert along with the industry's best customer support. Mobile Cause believes 100% of donations should go directly to your cause, which is why they don't charge any transaction fees and have the industry's lowest credit card processing fees. With Mobile Cause, you can raise more with less time and energy. Now let me introduce today's panel of experts. Vanessa Chase Lakshin is president of the Storytelling Nonprofit and author of the book, The Storytelling Nonprofit, a practical guide to telling stories that raise money and awareness. She is the creator of immersive online training programs for nonprofit professionals that assist in their fundraising and communications. Vanessa's approach goes beyond strategy and tactics to empower nonprofit professionals to be the expert in their organization needs. She has helped clients raise millions of dollars, increase monthly giving programs to over 5,000 donors, improve donor retention rates, and develop winning digital and donor stewardship strategies. Her clients have included Bernard College, Meals on Wheels Association of America, Girl Scouts of the USA, British Columbia's Children's Hospital, Senior Medicare Patrol, the Dixon Transition Society, Zanesville Museum of Art, Open Media, and more. Lindsay Hemphill is a digital marketing specialist with Mobile Cause, where she works one-on-one with nonprofits to maximize their success on fundraising campaigns. She creates and sets up fundraising campaigns, provides fundraising and donor engagement strategies, creates communication and promotional tools in support of the campaigns. Lindsay's work has enabled hundreds of Mobile Cause customers to successfully accelerate and increase their fundraising efforts. We do have a captivating and information-packed agenda for you today, where our speakers will cover capturing attention in a noisy environment, value-based storytelling, thinking like your audience, bringing your story to life, and 5 key components of storytelling. Okay, before we do dive into our storytelling insights, we do have a quick poll question for everybody. I'm going to go ahead and pop that poll up on your screen. So right now you should see a blue screen. I'll go ahead and read through that poll for you. Go ahead and select the response that best fits your mood. So how do you feel about your storytelling skills? I'm at a loss for words. Okay, there's a beginning, middle, and end, right? Doing good. I can keep my friends entertained. Awesome. Hollywood should be calling. I'll give you just a few seconds to submit those responses, and then we'll close it up and share out those results. Just a few more seconds, folks. All right, guys, let's take a look. What do we have here? Wow, that's so interesting how everyone's feeling about their skill set. I can tell this is going to be a fun and enlightening session together. Vanessa, what words of encouragement do you have for our storytellers today based on these results?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting to see everyone's responses to this. And I have to say, they're pretty similar to what I hear from a lot of nonprofit professionals. You're feeling okay, you're definitely got some momentum going, but there's this need to figure out where you can get more traction and leverage with your storytelling work. And hopefully that's what we're going to talk about here today.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
All right. So Elke, I have the control now of the presentation?
You do.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, thanks everyone so much for joining us today. I'm excited to talk a little bit about the angle of telling standout stories. So I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, that there's just this kind of saturation of a lot of information and content out there that's going to donor audiences and also non-donor audiences alike. And I think at this point, this place that we're at in 2019, especially with digital fundraising, one of the key challenges a lot of organizations are coming up against is how do we actually stand out in this very noisy landscape? How do we capture attention? How do we keep attention? And how do we translate that attention into donations? And today I want to talk about how storytelling can be a strategy for doing that. But of course, telling certain types of stories and approaching our storytelling with, slightly different intention and purpose than maybe we have before. So let's get into this. All right. So I want to say, though, one of the challenges I think we come up against when we talk about storytelling is a lot of times we get stuck in a certain storytelling box. And I tell this to my clients and students all the time that we feel like we have to tell stories a certain way for them to be quote unquote great stories. And maybe you can think of some examples. Maybe we have to tell stories like Charity Water, or maybe we have to tell only happy or sad stories, or maybe they have to be really like gut-wrenching, heartbreaking stories. It can be challenging when we get stuck in these mindsets that stories have to be told a certain way to be effective in fundraising. And on top of that, as I mentioned, we're really challenged by a lot of other things right now. We're challenged by this noisy space we're in. We're challenged to capture attention and own that attention over time. And we're also really challenged with telling captivating stories that stand out in this kind of noisy environment. So I want to talk about, what we can actually do in the face of some of these challenges and how we can get outside this storytelling box to actually tell stories that are authentic and really resonate with our organization's audience. And the thing I want you to know here from the outset is that there's a whole spectrum of interesting, emotional, and values driven stories that you can tell to your audience that will help you kind of pattern disrupt what people might normally see in content from nonprofits and hopefully capture that attention and build relationships and really meaningful relationships with your audience. So, in kind of trying to solve this strategy, though, one of the things that I see a lot of organizations try is trying to be what I call the loudest megaphone in this space. And so, what I mean by that is, in order to kind of stand out, to compete, they think the point of competition or the way to kind of stand out is to be the loudest person or loudest organization sharing stories and sharing content. And so a lot of times what happens for organizations is this means they're posting things constantly. They're kind of caught on what I would say is like the content creation hamster wheel, where they're having to create a lot of content and post things all the time. Or they're just kind of engaged in this really one-way communications strategy where they're not really engaging community building and they're not really encouraging conversation, which is certainly an important part of all this work that we're doing. And I want to talk about the fact that this is really, a good strategy to step away from. So if you think about what your organization is doing now and you feel like, we're just part of how we're trying to stand out is by being the loudest person or kind of posting a lot or competing on volume of our content and our stories, I would love for you to set that aside. put it on a shelf and just forget about it. There are many other ways and opportunities for you to stand out and that do not involve you kind of posting constantly or being, as I said, the loudest megaphone in the space. So the other strategy, though, that I see organizations trying to engage sometimes in their attempts to stand out and their attempts to figure out how to tell really compelling stories is what I would say is kind of this kind of like copycat methodology where they're working or they're copying what appears to be working for other organizations. And I would love for you right now to just think about, has there been a time where you've maybe copied a strategy or a tactic that you've seen worked for another organization? And did it work for your organization? Like, get honest with yourself for a second and really ask that question and think about, was it effective? Did it really work for us? And the reason I always point this out to organizations is that oftentimes there are other variables that go into the strategies and tactics organizations develop that are so different and so unique compared to your organization. So what may be working for another nonprofit may not necessarily work for yours. So if you see an organization that's telling, really like happy, delightful, I don't know, upbeat stories, and you think maybe that's what we should do, maybe that's like what will work for us, and you try it and it doesn't work, well, there could be a lot of reasons for that. And so what I always encourage organizations to do is figure out how to really carve their own path and how to kind of stand on their own in their own authenticity. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be thinking about. There's millions of nonprofits in the US. There has to be an opportunity for us to kind of own our own space and own our own donor audience, all of those things that kind of go into us having a really successful fundraising program. And so one of the things that I think about and I want to share with you today is this concept of standing out by embracing your organization's authenticity. So that last slide I showed you the crowded pool of a lot of fish that looks very similar. I often tell organizations that one of the things that we can do instead is think about how can we embrace who we are and what makes us different, what makes us the kind of different fish in that pond, so to speak. And I think this is a really useful tool for storytelling because when you embrace what makes your organization authentic and what makes it itself, we can really tell stories that get to the heart of our organization and the heart of often what draws people into our organization's community. So I just want to share a couple of questions that you can use for your own reflection to think about how this might help you and how you can kind of think about this for your organization. So one of the questions that I always start with in this process is what makes you you? And so this would be a question for your organization. What makes it itself? Like what are some of the qualities that really define your organization, its approach to its services and whatnot? I also really like the second question here. How do you do what you do differently? Which is a really interesting question for organizations to ask themselves, to think about positioning and how you are standing out and how you're really owning that in your communications and in your storytelling. You can also think about what you and your audience have in common, and you can also think about values and worldviews that might have in common with your audience or something that's really informing your organization's approach. And I want to say, I think these two pieces about, what you have in common with your audience and the values piece are really interesting. There's a great study out of the University of Indiana Lilly School of Philanthropy last year that cited that increasingly values-aligned giving is driving donors. So meaning donors are giving from a place of their values and they're giving as a way to make a statement about certain values that they have in the world. And so I think it's really useful to think about what values do people have that drive their giving to your organization? And how can you reflect those in some of the stories that you tell? How can you use values as a way to really position your organization's authenticity and make it kind of a strategy or tactic, so to speak, to stand out in this very noisy space of a lot of content and a lot of stories that might be out there? I really think that this is one of the only ways for organizations to stand out is to do what I would call like the soul searching work of digging down and identifying these really interesting and kind of essential components of what make your organization who it is and how it does its work in the world. So let's talk about this a little bit more and how this fits into storytelling. So when I talk to organizations about storytelling and figuring out how to really tell authentic stories, there are three things that I think are really essential to capture in those stories. So those three components are kind of the thinking, feeling, and doing pieces. And I'll explain what I mean by all of those, and we can talk about them a little bit more. So these pieces are essentially kind of like three layers to the story experience, or also to the giving experience, if you want to think about it that way. So the thinking layer is kind of the logical informational layer, excuse me. So on some level, all stories communicate information, right? I think about stories as a series of facts that are told with emotions and detail. And so on some level, there's information that people are getting, they're thinking a certain thing as they're reading this. And that's a really important layer that we start with. And sometimes, though, that's like where we stop with our storytelling. And I want to say that it's important to go deeper. We have to think about the emotional components and the acting components as well. So let's talk about the emotional layer, and I'll speak to this a little bit more on the next slide as well. This is a really important piece. So the feelings layer is the emotional aspect of the story, the emotional experience that you're trying to capture. It's also the emotional experience that you're trying to kind of be in communion with your audience on. So it's what you want them feeling as they're reading this story, as they're reading your appeal, or maybe reading your fundraising page, any of those things. And this is often an area where, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we get caught up in thinking that there's only kind of like two ways to tell this story. Maybe it's a really happy story or a really sad story. And I'll show you on the next slide that there's a much bigger spectrum to this. But as you plan out the story, it's really important to identify what this feeling is that you're trying to evoke and really bring out in your audience. Now, the last piece, and I think a lot of organizations are good at this last piece, the doing piece of it, which is really where we channel thinking and feeling into action, and where we're getting people to take what they've thought and what they're feeling and do something about it. So in our case, it's probably going to be getting them to make a donation. And this is all about laying the great groundwork to make a case for support and to be able to drive people to making that donation after they've read that story. So just a little reflection question for you as you're thinking about this, or maybe reflecting on your own organization's storytelling work. I would encourage you to think about which of these pieces are you kind of doing well right now? And maybe which ones are you, kind of needing to brush up your skills on, or maybe do a little bit more work on. All right, so let's talk about the feeling piece a little bit more, because there's definitely a lot more to talk about there. So one of the tools that I share with my clients and students to help them think about the broad emotional spectrum of storytelling that goes beyond just happy or sad stories is this chart. And it's Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions, which comes out of kind of the psychology world, but I think it's a useful tool for us here in the nonprofit sector. So he identified kind of 8 core emotions, which are in the inner circle here, you can see. And then as the petals go out, there's different kind of like uh, intensities of that feeling, and then they combine with each other to kind of develop other emotions and other experiences. So I think what's really interesting about this, though, is that it reminds us that there's such a wide spectrum of feelings that people can have about our work, about the things that we're doing, about the issues we work on in the world. And there's a value in having a more nuanced understanding of what those emotions are and being able to really tap into those things a little bit more. So I'll give you an example, and I think this is a particularly like kind of pointed example that we can look at. So I think about groups oftentimes that are working on climate change initiatives, for instance. So I think when I think about climate change giving and climate change activism, one of the kind of like key emotions that comes up for me a lot of times with those groups is like anger. People are angry about it. They're upset that it's happening. And a lot of times they're tapping into the urgency that comes out of that anger. But interestingly, I think one of the other things that we see sometimes in those organizations is also like this sadness that it's happening, and this kind of grief that like maybe there's this catastrophic thing that we can't stop. And so I think just kind of thinking about like what are kind of the primary and secondary or even like tertiary emotional experiences that people are having around the issues that your organization is working on will lead you to telling much more nuanced and interesting stories that tap into all those different emotional experiences that your audience may be having. A couple of other questions you can consider as well. So, one thing that I always consider when I'm working on stories is what feelings mirror what your audience feels. So, I want to really feel like I'm with the audience in the experience and I'm meeting them where they're at. So, if you can identify those things, maybe you've done some audience surveys or some research on your audience, you can kind of pinpoint that a little bit more. And then you can also look at, do values lead into certain feelings? So that can be another way you can identify maybe the feelings or the emotional experience that you want to tap into in that story. All right, so let's look at a couple more tips, and I want to share a few examples with you just to show you this in action. So, I'm sure some of you are probably thinking right now, these are some big concepts. They're interesting. Maybe they're very different than how you've been approaching storytelling in the past. And that's okay. I want to underscore, though, that telling stories should never be a make work project for your organization. In fact, I often tell folks that, if you're just telling a story for the sake of telling a story, you can press the pause button on that. It's never worth doing that because that means that you do not have kind of a strategy or a purpose behind the stories that you're telling on behalf of your organization. What I would much rather you do is take the time to really identify the purpose of the story, the strategy that's going into it, so that you can be much more effective and impactful with the stories that you're putting out there. I also want to say too, though, that I think there's kind of this myth in our space that we constantly have to be creating new stories to share with our audience. That, once we've told a story one time, people are going to remember it. It's just going to become redundant content. It will be a turnoff to them to see something they've seen before. And I think that's actually a bad assumption at this point. And I'll tell you why. I would love for you to just think about what you scrolled through on social media this morning or what you maybe saw in your inbox. Like, do you remember a specific thing that you saw? Maybe there's like a handful of things that you can recall, but there's probably a lot of content that you scrolled past or interacted with that you don't actually remember. And I think to the point about this being kind of a noisy space that we operate in, sometimes the thing that we can do is really repurpose our stories for different channels to get them in front of different audiences, or strategically share those stories more than once so that we are getting them in front of our audience and hopefully having more people see those things. I think this is a really strategic thing for organizations to do because it allows you to be more resourceful with the time and resources that you have to dedicate to storytelling and content creation as it relates to your fundraising program. So I would say, don't get overwhelmed by the fact that, you feel like you have to create lots of new stories and have lots of content to put out there. I think you really can get great results from just a couple of really good stories that you can use strategically over the course of a couple of weeks or even a couple of months, depending on the type of campaign or fundraising that you want to be doing. So let's look at a couple of examples here. I pulled some examples from the Oregon Zoo, and I have to say they're one of my favorite nonprofits to follow on Twitter. They're always producing really interesting storytelling content over on Twitter. And I thought that this was a really good example of what it looks like to repurpose content and to retell stories over multiple platforms. So this work that they're doing started over here on the right-hand side with this image and this video that they put together around protecting polar bear families in the Arctic. And they put together a story about why this was so important. It ties into some of the zoo's activism and policy work and definitely speaks to a very certain, I would say, segment of their audience who cares about kind of environmental activism and the zoo. So maybe not everyone, but it's certainly a portion of their audience, and that's probably why they created this. So they then took this in another way and they used it again on National Polar Bear Day. And they used that as an opportunity to promote this campaign that they're running, to tell the story of it and to tell the story and also convey the urgency of something needing to be done about it. And finally, they also shared something over on their blog as well, where they tied it into marking the birthday of one of their polar bears, actually two of their polar bears, who were twins. And so they just use that as a nice opportunity to kind of tie in this campaign that they're running, tie it into animals that they actually have at the zoo, and continue to tell the stories in different ways and in slightly different perspectives. So another example I'll just show you here, we'll go to the next slide, is, oh, one too far there. I'll go back. So this example here is from WAVA Rape Crisis Center, just a, I would say, small kind of organization in Vancouver where I used to live. And they're really great at telling stories, which might be surprising. You might think, oh, they work with victims of sexual assault. Isn't it difficult for them to tell stories? It actually hasn't been. They've been really good at navigating issues around confidentiality, and I can certainly speak to that if some of you have questions later. But I wanted to share some examples of stories that they put together and kind of just show you how they've repurposed those stories in a lot of different ways. So they did a series on getting to know the people behind WAVA, and so they were profiling staff and telling stories about why staff felt so called to do this work and so invested in the work the organization was doing. So they did a piece on their blog about their volunteer and educational outreach coordinator. And then they took that same piece over to social media to introduce staff to people who follow them there and also to the donors as well. And I would just say, staff have fantastic perspective on the work that you're doing, and that because you're here at this webinar. There's probably something that got you to work at the organization you work at. Maybe there's some connection you have to it, some personal value that brought you to that work. And that's really valuable to share. We don't always just have to focus on telling beneficiary stories. There can be all sorts of perspectives we can bring to the storytelling work that can help us to connect with different people and connect them to the people who make up our organization. All right, so just to wrap up, before we turn it over to Lindsay, I want to just share a couple of storytelling tips for this year with you. So a few things I'm thinking about, and I would encourage you to think about as well. So when it comes to telling really interesting stories that captivate people, and I think ones that are, I would say, sticky and get a lot of traction with audiences, they often are connected to a bigger picture. And what I mean by that is that those stories are connected to stories that are happening in the news or pop culture moments or political moments. So if you can tie in your storytelling to something else that your audience might be hearing about or maybe cares about because they've seen it somewhere else or seeing it in lots of places online or offline, that's a really great way to make your work relevant and to really contextualize it in a much bigger picture. I would also encourage you to think about forming opinions about things because opinions inform narrative and story. And I know a lot of times organizations will shy away from wanting to have opinions about things, about politics, about pop culture, anything like that, because it might seem like it has the opportunity to polarize your audience and maybe it means losing some people from your audience. But I think that at this point in time, it's really important to have opinions because they really will inform how people understand your organization and relate to it. So, I'm not saying they have to be like controversial opinions or anything, but it is good to take a stand. And even if that's just a stand about having a certain value in your work. I would also encourage you to do a lot of listening to your audience. I spend a lot of time in my storytelling work encouraging organizations to really deeply understand their audiences and who it is they're telling stories to so that they are much more able to connect with those people and really tell stories that resonate. And so I would encourage you to do the same. Do some listening online, talk to people more often, really do some research to understand who it is you're telling stories to so that you can be a much more strategic and impactful storyteller. And lastly, I always say this tip, and it's partially for myself, but also for others as well who maybe identify as having a little bit of perfectionist tendencies. But I would encourage you to take imperfect action more often and really learn from it. I think one of the best things we can do as fundraisers is be testing, be experimenting, and be learning from what it is we're doing. And so I would encourage you, if you're feeling a little on the fence about your storytelling skills or you're not sure where to get started, I would encourage you to just start. Write a story, get something out there, learn from it, and continue to evolve and move towards better practices and better strategies for your work. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Lindsay to continue the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for your incredible insight and tips. As a quick reminder to our audience, if you do have any questions, you can submit them into the questions box on your control panel as we go along. Now let's go ahead and turn it over to Lindsay Hemphill from Mobile Cause to hear more on how to craft authentic stories. Don't forget to have your worksheet out and ready for the writing prompts. Okay, go ahead and take it away, Lindsay.
Thanks, Elke, and thanks everyone for joining with us today. Today I'm going to be going through the most important parts of storytelling in a little bit more detail. So there hopefully will be really something in here for all levels of storytellers. And as Elke said, there is that worksheet available, and the worksheet is really designed to help you brainstorm. So please feel free to follow along, jot things down as we go through the different steps. And Vanessa had some really great tips on how to use those authentic emotional stories to stand out from the crowd. So I'd like to recommend just keep that in mind as you're starting to think about your story within these different components. And hopefully by the end, you'll have a great start to a story that you'll be able to go out and share with your audience. So let's go ahead and jump in. So before we get straight to the different components of the story, I want to talk a little bit about the structure. So as you're bringing your story to life, you want to put your story in a framework that people are well acquainted with so that it becomes more digestible for your audience. By doing this, you're inhibiting boredom and making it easier for your audience to follow along. And it also allows the content to be adapted to the different lengths and mediums for which you're sharing. So as Vanessa was mentioning, repurposing that content through different channels. And by having a set framework, you make it easier for yourself as you're adapting those for those different channels. So it's also helpful because it helps create a natural buildup to the ask. And a little later, we'll take a look at just what point that natural ask will come up in the story. But by having that framework, you will be able to move forward, change it as you need, and start sharing your stories out. All right. 1, 2, 4. Sorry about that. Okay, so the 5 key components of storytelling. So to create this familiar framework, you want to follow along with these 5 key components as you're approaching your story. So thinking to Pixar and Disney movies, something everyone's seen, you'll get the same general components in most of these stories, and yours should be similar just with different content, your organization's content. So beginning with once upon a time, introduce character or two, and then start talking about the path of your main characters or what your main characters are doing as part of your story. Then every story has a villain, so introducing the obstacles that your organization is facing, the battle of good versus evil, so really kind of that climax of the story, and the resolution, so the results from the campaign. So we'll be going through today each one of these steps to just dig a little bit more in detail there. All right, starting with Once Upon a Time. So this is more or less your character introduction. So starting to think about who are the main characters in your story. Primarily, your beneficiaries will likely be your most obvious main characters, and those are who are benefiting from your organization's work. Now, while your beneficiaries might seem like the most obvious, your main characters can also be different people within your organization. Sometimes this is leadership, so board members, potentially sponsors who help your organization do what you're able to do. And this could also include your staff, which may even be you. So, what role do you play within your organization? Why are you passionate about your area of work? And how are you adding value to the cause? So, just beginning to think about who are your main characters and who is your story going to focus on. Now, this is a great time for that worksheet. One of the first questions, your main characters, so feel free to jot down some ideas there. who are the main characters that stand out to you, and determine who has the biggest impact towards your campaign. And right here, we have an example over here on the left from Ursinus College. And this is a social media post that introduces one of their main characters, Jaylene Rodriguez. It really puts her front and center with the image there. And the post gives you a really immediate idea of who this story is about. So in the text there, it's introducing Jaylene. It also gives a nod to a second character, the VP and Dean of Enrollment, Dave Tobias. And it's introducing those two characters together. And they've done it really strategically here, where they include a little snapshot of the characters and allow you to click the link to read the rest of the story. So a really good strategic move just from a social media standpoint, allowing people to click in and read more. And it gives a little bit of background exactly about what the campaign is about. Now, a good tip here is to focus on an individual versus a large number of people or a large group. And this helps your organization make the story more personal. So here we have Jaylene, and it's really kind of emphasizing that by highlighting or spotlighting an individual, one character, it's easier for the audience to follow along and more digestible for them to understand the story that you are sharing. All right. Moving on to the next step, so the path of your main characters. In the movies, after the main characters have been introduced, you start to get to know them, and you're really going on this journey with them, following their actions, seeing them in their daily lives, and at this point, you're starting to build an emotional connection to the characters. So you're invested in their story, and you begin to become invested in their path towards success or what they're hoping to achieve. So at this point in your storytelling, you'll want to elaborate on your organization's main character's path. What are their daily activities? What situation are they in? What is their setting? And this may also relate to the programs or initiatives that your organization is running to help support the main character's actions. So on the worksheet, the next two questions really go into what is the setting and what are your organization's main characters dedicated to do. So feel free to jot down. And the example over here on the right, their reference, this is an organization, Wildlife SOS, another social media post. And within this post, they're referencing themselves as the main characters of the story. And it begins to lead into the programs that they offer. Down in below in the title, you'll see the role of sanctuaries in creating change in animal welfare. So it begins to insert themselves into the story while still conveying the emotions that the main character's organization and the animals face with that opening sentence there. When we see animals in need, there's a visceral reaction. So immediately you're emotionally connected to the character and also aware of the programs in place and what the organization is really set to do to help these characters out. All right. And to the next point of our storytelling, every story has a villain. And from the perspective of your organization, the villain takes shape in the challenges or obstacles that your organization is facing. The question then becomes, what is preventing good from prevailing over evil? Is it a lack of funding? Is it trouble delivering goods? So this is the point where you would be able to elaborate on the issue that your organization is facing. And that will ultimately lead into outlining how the donor can help. Whether this obstacle is a person, place, or thing, don't be afraid to describe it in detail so that your audience is really aware of the problem. And so this might be one of the easier parts of the worksheet to complete because you're probably pretty aware of what obstacles your organization is currently facing. So what is preventing from you from helping more people like your main character? And just while you're thinking about that, be sure to remember to keep it emotional and relatable so that it really has that connection with the audience. The example we see over here on the left, this organization used video to tell their story. And within the video, it starts off with individuals introducing characters, their aunt, mother, grandmother, best friend's mother, great uncle. And all of these different individuals were affected by breast cancer. So it goes on to explain the villain, in this case, cancer, and the organization does a great job to problematize the issues and explains the issues at hand. So another kind of pro tip here, um, detail your obstacle by detailing your obstacles, you can cast your donor as the hero arriving for help. So this is especially helpful because it allows you to introduce the donor into the story that you're telling, really make them feel involved with what your organization is doing, and cast them as the hero as part of the story. So again, really building that emotional connection directly to them by involving them as part of the entire story. Okay. For the next part of storytelling, the battle of good versus evil. So at this point, how is your organization overcoming these obstacles? This really becomes the climax of the story. And this is usually the time where your organization is actively running the campaign. So you've introduced the main characters, you've outlined the villain or the problems that you're facing, and now you have the opportunity to propose the solution. This is the part of the story that really lends itself perfectly to the call to action, as the donor needs to know the solution to the problem and how they will be able to contribute. So you'll want to communicate clearly to the donor exactly how they can help, and emphasize the different actions that they can take. So most obviously, this could be in the form of monetary donations, but this could also take shape in different ways, such as volunteering. Do you need volunteers as part of this campaign? Or even the idea of ambassadors. Do you need help spreading the word, whether it's on social media, gathering people who are invested with your organization's story at this point? If you need them to help share out the story even further, reach more eyes, this is a good place to involve that call to action. So for the next question on the worksheet, what are the proposed actions that you're presenting to your supporters to solve this issue? So feel free to jot any ideas down there. While we look at the example, we have an example, Books for Healing, as part of a campaign done by the organization Break the Silence Against Domestic Violence. So here you'll see there's a story right next to the donation form, which strategically is perfectly optimized. It allows the donor to read the story on the left, see exactly the individuals involved with the story, and then on the right, an immediate option to take action. So just strategically, as far as how this was put on the website, is great. But this example shows how support positively impacts the beneficiaries of the organization. In this case, the story explains that books and resources are provided to individuals who have experienced domestic violence and how those books promote healing. It gives the reader an immediate way to take action there, and so it really shows that tangible evidence on how the organization is doing good and exactly how the donor can take action right then and there. And to a previous point we discussed earlier, it's focusing on one specific individual in this case so that it's really easily relatable for the donor. So again, to that kind of pro tip, focusing on one individual rather than a large group, which may not be as easily digestible for your audience. All right. Now that we've introduced the call to action, you've told your story, people have followed along, you've probably raised funds at this point. It may seem like things are over, but they definitely are not. Your audience needs a resolution to the story. So oftentimes we see some organizations skip this step, but it is an incredibly important part of your campaign. Your donors need to know the ending, otherwise, it's just a huge cliffhanger. So, the resolution here is your organization's opportunity to elaborate on the results of the campaign and the work that was done. You'll want to think about how you can involve your supporters in the outcome of the campaign and within that celebration. How did they support? How did they become the hero in this story? How were they part of the success of the campaign? You'll want to update and share how the proceeds are, where they're going, and how they're helping, and give regular updates on the main characters. Don't be afraid to thank your donors multiple times and show them just how appreciative you are, so that they really feel like they were part of the solution and part of the campaign. Now, another tip, plan to keep communicating with your audience 4 to 6 weeks after the campaign to show the resolution of your story. So oftentimes you have a set end date for a campaign. We'd like to raise funds by May 30th, and that's the ending. But your campaign really shouldn't end there. You should have at least a tail end of 4 to 6 weeks where you're using that time to communicate just as often as you were within the actual campaign to share the resolution and use that time for some stewardship of your donors. Now, if you didn't reach your goal, don't be afraid to communicate that. You still have the opportunity for donations to come in. So you'd like to really celebrate how much you've gotten so far and how your donors have helped you reach that. But this could be an opportunity to allow donations to still come in. Now, all this resolution and all this thanking only benefits your organization, especially looking ahead into either the next campaign or just the work that your organization is continuing to do. A proper resolution really sets your donors up to give again and become recurring donors. Because in the future, they're more familiar with your story and have seen those tangible outcomes from their previous support. So you build a stronger connection, you build some trust with those donors, and they're more likely to participate in the future. So at this point, you can jot down your happy and successful ending on the worksheet. And perhaps this is the outcome or the goal that you're striving towards at this point as part of the brainstorming process. Now, the example over here on the left is a screenshot from a social media post from Prison Entrepreneurship Program. And it's showing a before and after of one of their main characters. And before and afters work really great for this resolution because they really show how the main characters are permanently changed from the outcome of the campaign. It really helps to demonstrate the value of the donor's contribution in a really easy and tangible way for the donors to see. And it helps to give that rewarding feeling by bringing in that emotional connection that donors can connect to. All right. Now, some pro tips to keep in mind. A story can really be fit to any size or format. So whether that's a 15-second Instagram video that you're sharing or a multi-week long email campaign, sometimes you can modify and adapt your story to fit the different length or medium that you're sharing it out on. So you can also keep in mind that you can share your story all in one go, whether that's one post that you're sharing everything in, or break it up into story bite-sized chunks that you can share over a certain period of time. So really don't be afraid to adapt your story to whatever channel or method you're hoping to share it out in. And hopefully by following that framework, it'll make it easier to have a clear defined idea of what your story is so that you can modify and mold it to how you need. Now, another pro tip, your story components don't have to be in that order. The only thing to keep in mind is don't skip any. So whether you're introducing the villain first, what's your obstacle, or like to go straight into the action part of it. What is your organization or what are your main characters doing to make change? You can switch up the order. Just don't skip any of the points so that you are sure to really and capture all of the different things as part of your story, and especially that resolution. Now, one of the last pro tips here is your story should include an authentic ask versus lots of donation buttons. So again, to Vanessa's point, really making the story authentic, emotional, connecting with your audience is more important than all of the donation buttons that you could have in like an email. So rather than have a donation button at the beginning, middle, and end, having a really clear, emotionally connecting story with a strong call to action will be the most effective as far as encouraging people to take action with what your organization is doing. All right. Now, as far as storytelling tools, a few different channels that you want to keep in mind as you're telling your story. The data supports that video is one of the most persuasive forms of content. So really one of the best forms of storytelling. I'm sure all of you see in your feed every day, your social media feeds, videos about all different types of things. Videos currently make up about 80% of all consumer-based web traffic, so by far the majority. And by using video, it really allows you to build a stronger emotional connection and allows you to tell your story in a way that's more viewable, more shareable, and an easy way for your audience to consume. So highly recommend using videos as a method of storytelling. And you'll also want to take a multi-channel approach. So you want to be sure to share your story through all of the channels that you're communicating on. This could be email, social media, direct mail, even text messaging. And what we see is that when you're communicating through multiple channels, you'll have about a 37% increase in response rates. So it's really important to share through all of your communication lines so that you're reaching the widest audience possible. And another storytelling tool, donor surveys. So use email communications to survey your donors about the experience with your cause. Ultimately, their story is part of your story. Their involvement is what gives your organization success. And they're supporting the great work that you do. So surveys offer a great way to learn about what interests them and also about their personal journey relating to your organization so that you can involve their stories with your organization's story with their permission, of course. All right. And with that, I'm going to pass things back to Elke.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for sharing such valuable information with us today. We do hope you're all super excited to work on your stories and see your content really connect with your supporters. Now we're going to go ahead and launch another poll before we do jump into the Q&A. So let me go ahead and pop that onto the screen for you. So let us know if you like what you heard and if you'd like more information from Mobile Cause or the Storytelling Nonprofit. And again, we'll leave that open for a few seconds to give you the opportunity to submit your vote. All right, we're going to go ahead and close that poll up. I think the majority of you have voted. Thank you for those responses. So here we are at our Q&A portion of things. So let's go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions we've received. As a reminder, feel free to continue to submit any others as we do go along. So let's see, our first question is from Cheryl, and it's for Vanessa. So Cheryl's wondering, how detailed should we get with our stories? I want to pull in the true emotion of the story and sometimes feel it's difficult to do so without info, but I've been told that too much detail may divulge too much. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Cheryl. I think it's a balance a lot of organizations struggle with in terms of trying to figure out how to tell stories that have like an emotional hook and an emotional quality to them, but without being like so bogged down in detail and emotion that it's like it's taking away from the main points that you want to get to. So one of the things that I would recommend doing is spending some time looking at stories that you like, that you've seen, that you think are really interesting, and just think about like what balance of emotions and details are in those stories compared to yours, and see if there's some things you can learn from those stories and kind of take some, take those and develop your own best practices. I would also say with your stories as well, if you're concerned about like divulging too much information about someone personally, the other thing I would highly recommend is giving that person some agency over how the story is told. So allowing them to take a look at it before you share it, to ask them if they're comfortable with the details that are being shared. And that might also give you a way to just kind of keep that in check.
Great, thank you. We have another question for you. This question is from Taylor. How can an organization tell a story or show what they do if the victims have to remain anonymous?
Yeah, good question, Taylor. Yeah, so I kind of alluded to that a little bit in one of the examples I shared from a rape crisis center. So there's lots of organizations that deal with confidentiality for a variety of reasons, and I think it is very important to take that seriously, depending on what the circumstances are. So if your organization is working in healthcare and you're kind of dealing with HIPAA as one of your concerns and kind of a guideline for what you can and can't say in communications about patients. The thing that I remind healthcare organizations of is that, you can still ask people if they want to share their story. And so long as they say yes and sign a release form, you can absolutely talk about their experience and work with them to tell that story. If you are not a healthcare organization and you're working with, vulnerable population or a population where there's some confidentiality issues, I would still suggest a similar approach. We often make the assumption that because someone's been through something really difficult, or, this has been an experience that maybe they don't want to share with someone, we assume they don't want to share it. So I would just encourage you to talk to people and ask them if they are interested in sharing their story, and to try to identify people who are probably at a place where they are most likely to be comfortable sharing a story. So maybe working with your program staff to understand where some of your clients are in their journey or in their process, and to try to hopefully select people who are at a stage where they feel, well resourced and hopefully a little bit more resilient to participate in that process. So those are a couple of tips I would give you around that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Vanessa. So, Lindsay, we have a question for you from Nancy. Is it advisable to share the fundraising goal with your audience?
Great question. And the answer is most often yes. So especially if that goal is attainable, and if you can use that goal to kind of break down into something tangible, it's a great thing to share with your audience. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a goal of $10,000, but by reaching your goal, you're able to provide 100 kits for the homeless or something. So if you're able to break down your goal, especially if it's a larger goal so that it's more digestible for your audience, they can more easily connect to it and hopefully have some kind of guidance or guidelines on how much they should give. So if it's $100, maybe that's going to up the amount I was planning to give so that I can give one full kit to someone in need. So definitely feel free to share out your goal with your audience and also the progress towards the goal. So some milestones, maybe it's when you hit 50, 75, 100%, and don't be afraid to celebrate your success in relation to your goal.
Great. Thank you so much. It looks like that's all that we have time for. We're coming up at the end of the time here. So I'd like to thank everybody for submitting your questions. If you do have additional questions that were not answered today, please feel free to email marketing@mobilecause.com. If you are interested in discovering how to accelerate your fundraising and raise more funds with less time and effort, please fill out our post-webinar survey or visit www.mobilecause.com. For more information on storytelling, download a free chapter from Vanessa's book at thestorytellingnonprofit.com/free-chapter. Thank you again so much for everyone for attending today, and best of luck in all your storytelling efforts. We do look forward to seeing you again next month at our next interactive workshop. Have a wonderful day.